All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I have a very awesome guest uh, today, James Linehan. And I've been a big fan of your work, James. You know, you have a channel on YouTube, Intersex Truther. I highly recommend everyone go check it out. He does not have nearly as many subscribers as he should, given the quality of his videos and the important topics that he's covering and how much effort he puts into them, which have a lot of important you know um, arguments and facts in regards to kind of the science of transgenderism and intersex conditions. And so you are a wealth of information, James. So I'm really happy to have this conversation with you because there's a lot of stuff in the news right now with the Olympics boxing controversy, which we'll definitely talk about. But why don't you just introduce yourself and give a brief summary of your life story, which is super fascinating, and then we can kind of go from there. And
Yeah. Well, thanks, Ray, for having me on. It's always nice that people are curious about this condition. So, I was born in, I guess, the late '60s. So I'm an old guy, and I was born with a very particular condition called hypogonadism, and what that entails is it's a pituitary condition, which means my pituitary gland could not go into the sinusoidal release of hormones. So I basically was born normal, and I stayed relatively undeveloped as a young kid because there was no my unbeknownst to me, my pituitary gland was not producing the appropriate amounts of signaling to tell my gonads to produce the hormones of androgen. This condition is you can't really tell at the onset when you're born. Only when you're supposed to start going through puberty, where the other kids go through puberty, where they start to isolate a problem going on with me, because I stayed much like an adolescence, a pre-progressive male that didn't go through puberty. And I had my father's in the medical field, so he would bring me to a lot of doctors, and eventually an intern noticed that I was just not maturing. And basically that means that he checked my genitals, and they were the size of like a child's genitals. They weren't, there wasn't any sort of puberty whatsoever. So usually they get really worried at that point because they are worried about tumors and stuff like that. They worry about something in the pituitary gland that's preventing my gland to exclude the proper chemicals. So I was sent to the University of California, San Francisco. You will know that by its name. That's where Jack Turbin works. That is the main child endocrine medicine clinic. It's a top endocrine medicine clinic for pediatric endocrinology. And back then, gender ideology and gender affirmative care and all that was just it was just an apple in someone's eye. It was still being written. I believe the queer paper that started it all was actually being typed out around 1986, 1987, when I first showed up at the it was a pediatric endocrine center at the time, and I saw a person named Dr. Conti there, and he was the head of the clinic, and he, they put me through all sorts of tests. They first x-rayed me. They gave me CAT scans. They tested my chromosomes. They're basically going through every other possible thing that could possibly be wrong, why I didn't go through puberty. And so they tested all that, and all came back normal. And then they described it as a sleepy pituitary gland, which is kind of common folk, that my pituitary gland didn't start puberty, because that's what the pituitary gland is supposed to do when you're a boy around 12 or 13, same with a girl, 11 with a girl. your pituitary gland is supposed to start the LH and FH hormones, and it pulsates. It sends out pulsate waves of these hormones, and it stimulate gonads. Your gonads start developing, and you start developing into a man or a woman. You go through puberty. So they describe this as basically as my endocrinologist said, a symphony of hormones. That means your pituitary gland is a conductor, and it just starts, launching all these hormones and all these, and it guides you through puberty as you grow up. Between 11 and around 16 is when pituitary is basically, the child's gone through puberty. Should be between 12 and 16. So you don't have, and since I showed up there around 16, I was supposed to be at that time completely mature. I was supposed to be basically Tanner stage 4, which means my body would have already gone through all the changes. So I started at 16. So what they told me is saying was, well, since we can't restart your pituitary gland, we would like to restart your pituitary gland. We cannot match your natal puberty. We can inject you with androgen and basically take you through the steps. We can hit you through all your steps, but once we start doing that, we start interfering with the pituitary gland, and then you'll be stuck as a medical patient for life. And they described it saying, well, you'll suffer from infertility, and you have all these other, a lot of emotional problems, and but if we don't, and it goes on much longer, your cells will freeze, and you will basically be locked into this pre-adolescent state. And at the time I was playing with boys, girls, boys much younger than my age. I was playing with dolls. I was just all around completely immature for what I was supposed to be at. And the physician said, well, basically it's because the puberty is required for a child to grow for both physical and mental maturity. So your body and your mind and all these other things. I also had severe learning disabilities. These are all supposed to be remedied with puberty. These things get fixed in puberty. And before I was, I would be girls were fancy, but I wasn't really interested. I didn't understand what men and women were as far as objects. I just understood them as, the girls and boys. I would hang out with other boys and they'd talk about girls, but I didn't understand what they're talking about, because my body was not maturing at all. You really have to have a base of maturity before you understand these things. And this is what people keep missing. You have to go through puberty in order to figure out what it's like to be a man and a woman. There's no such thing as a pre-adolescent who understands what a man and woman are like.
Right. Yeah, that's super fascinating. Thanks for sharing your story. So my first question is, like, I read this paper. It was a preprint paper, came out, I think, of Yale recently. I could be wrong about that, but it was a sort of a critique of the CAS review. And one of the criticisms of the CAS review is that they accused Hillary Cass of having a paternalistic lens, and that they offer this alternative framework for understanding puberty blockers, and they sort of conceptualized it like analogous to reproductive rights. So they say, pregnancy is a natural process, but we have bodily autonomy, and we can choose whether or not to go through puberty or go through pregnancy or not. And so we ought to preserve that. So even though pregnancy is like a natural process, like, we can't assume that it's like a good thing, like intrinsically, to go through pregnancy, because you might depending on your views on abortion rights and stuff like this. And so the analogy was with like a puberty, if you're one of these, children with a gender incongruence, they'll say like, well, puberty is like a natural phenomenon, but we like can't assume it's necessarily like healthy or intrinsically good to go through it, because it's just like the pregnancy, it's like it's natural, but we can't assume it's like good. So from your perspective, like, how would you respond to that sort of framework in terms of like, well, this is like a matter of like like a reproductive right over controlling our own bodies, and so these young children, they have this like autonomous right to like choose their embodiment, and like going through puberty is like or like not going through your natal puberty is like no big deal. And it's like they'll say that these puberty blocker drugs are well tolerated, and the safety profile is not that crazy. So what would be your response to like that sort of argument?
Okay, so that argument it's kind of mixing a lot of things up. So first thing, my hypogonadism can be in before I restart. My hypogonadism you can be born with my hypogonadism, which is about 1 in 80,000. It's very rare. Or you can induce it in children with puberty blockers. So puberty blockers cause the same state my pituitary gland was in. It causes the same symptoms of my so it's essentially naturally, my body is a puberty blocker. So that's why I know a lot about this. Pregnancy is something a woman goes through to have children. Not every woman gets pregnant or chooses to have children. So it's a reproductive thing. So that it's completely separate. It has nothing to do with development. It's has nothing to do with any part of a female's mental or physical life other than wanting to reproduce. A matter of fact, pregnancy traditionally was very, very dangerous because women died in pregnancy a lot in the old days. So if they chose, they would probably skip that. So that's not something that's a complete red herring, okay? Because it's that's something that they reproduce. Puberty, on the other hand, is actually a critical part of human development. And this idea that children need to choose whether or not to go through puberty or not to go through puberty is akin to telling children they can either stay in a pre-adolescent state or not, or somehow they have this concept of going to an opposite puberty, which doesn't work. So hormones are sex specific. So if you have a male, it's androgen. If you have a female, it's estrogen. These are hardwired within our chromosomes and hardwired within our cells. So they do not respond opposite. So you can't put androgen into a female and expect to get any other thing other than the fact that cosmetically they will look like a male. Just as a same thing, if you put estrogen in a female, in a male, you will get a cosmetic appearance of a female.
Well, isn't the argument though that they'll say is like, well, that cosmetic effect is actually critical to the mental well-being, because they need that cosmetic effect in order to, pass better as their target, opposite sex embodiment goals or whatever. So it's like they'll say like, well, all of our discrimination and problems are due to the fact that we don't like blend in as our identified gender. So for example, a lot of like males, like trans identified males, will say like, well, the like puberty, the like natal puberty masculinizes you so much, and so that prevents you from passing. And since passing is presumed to be this like golden ticket to like the best possible trans life, they'll say that like, yeah, like maybe there's like some health repercussions or whatever, but it's worth it because passing is like the main goal of like the people who have this gender issue, and it's particularly when you drill into like these specifics of like the autogonaphilic desire to embody that, and sort of the torture psychologically when that autogonaphilic impulse is denied because you've gone through this masculinization process. And some people have like very strong like repulsion of their like male body, for example.
I see. Yes.
So I'm curious, like your
Yeah.
response to that argument.
Yeah. That argument assumes that this a male this gender dysphoria cannot be treated any other way. So there's only one way of treating it. That's changing your body. While the problem with AGP and all that is their minds, is their psychological state. So if they have that impulsion, or if they have that desire, that has got to be handled some other way, because even you cannot pre-guess. Like, for instance, if they chose it as adults to kind of go as children, they probably would have either regretted it because they would have ended up in a somewhat a disordered state because their bodies would have never matured, or the fact that most of their problems would have went away in puberty anyway, and their puberty actually corrected a lot of things that they did not know that they were experiencing at the time. You see what I mean? They're witch casting in the past, and this witch casting in the past depends on what their present ideas about what their mental state is like. So the key is psychiatrists have had successes with AGPs and so forth to put them in group therapy with other AGPs and get them to understand that the reality of their presentation can be dealt with psychologically and emotionally with counseling and other means, so they can live better lives. I'm not saying that they don't, you know.
It is interesting because even Blanchard himself, posited that transition can be a viable treatment, particularly when so much of the anguish of organophilia is like due to the like the torture of like the male testosterone driven sex drive. So by kind of chemically castrating yourself, you sort of like reduce like the anguish of being under the duress of that thing. But I wanted to kind of switch gears now a little bit and get into these more current political controversies, particularly with this Olympics thing, because I find this to be really fascinating. Because on the one hand, you have people sort of denying that this is even a thing, and they'll say like, well, this is just speculation and allegations by corrupt international boxing agency that is like Russian led and it's corrupt, and they're just made these allegations, and like these are just women because she's been like assigned female at birth. And so it's sort of like using this concept like, well, she was assigned female at birth and she was raised female, so therefore she's a woman, therefore she and you're just sort of being racist because there's like a long history of like critiquing women of color for being too masculine and not fitting into these like white European beauty standards, and this is just natural variation. So I'm not sure how up to date you are on like the facts of the situation, but I wanted to sort of like ask you, why do you think the trans community is so defensive over this particular issue, even though it's like clearly has nothing to do with like transness?
Well, I think the people who are very defensive are actually the sort of the activists, the non-trans activists who have taken this on as somewhat of a, like the younger millennials types who've decided to take every single cause up that they hear about and push it as a human right. So with these players, boxing. First thing, we're talking about boxing here. So this is a sport that is dominated by males. I mean, males have bigger wrists. They have bigger hands. They have longer arms. They have thicker skulls. They're far more stronger. So the danger of women boxing anybody who has gone through male puberty or responds to testosterone is high. So this puts a real onus on females who go into these sports to make sure they're dealing with other females. And the countries, particularly small countries, have had a long history of cheating in the Olympics. So they have been passing off males as females for 70 years, and you can see it because putting a male into a boxing, even a smallish male, is very, very lucrative. They get medals. They don't have to train very hard. They don't have very much infrastructure. They can beat all the females up. And so they have a lot of pressure to bring trophies home. So these organizations find any way they can to kind of get around the rules and to cheat on these competitions. So that's been going on for quite some time. And since all this trans stuff is going on and all these intersex conditions that no one quite understands is just being thrown in the mix, they're starting to capitalize on that. And they're starting to try to cheat using that. And for some reason, we assume that these individuals are somehow have some sort of disorder, which they never claim they've had. Remember, as far as I'm clear, they've never claimed to have a disordered sex development. They've not offered any evidence of that. And they've just said that these are females and they're a bit more, I guess, masculine, even though if you look at them, you just say, oh, these look like males. And so I'm a little skeptical on the fact that these people have any condition whatsoever, because the conditions that keep getting thrown around are extremely rare. Like, for instance, they called them androgen sensitivity. Well, there's only 3 androgen sensitivities, and they're both about the main one is complete androgen sensitivity. And complete androgen sensitivity features basically it is the one condition that they called intersex when they first ran into this condition. These are basically failed XY. Basically, they went through development and the in the womb around 8 weeks of the pregnancy, when the fetus starts to grow and differentiate into the two either males or females, the fetus itself didn't respond at all to androgen. And so what the fetus did is it switched the androgen to estrogen. So they actually grew as if they were females, but they had internal testicles. So that's what they call intersex originally. It was these individuals that they didn't understand what was going on with them, but they found gonads, yet they found breasts, normal development of breasts that women have, normal development of sexual function, all that women have, yet they had these internal testicles. So they thought they were between sex, but really they were a very rare disorder which causes this unique metamorphosis. Now these are essentially women or girls, and since their bodies don't respond to androgen, they have very brittle bones and they don't put on any muscle, so they're weaker than females. They're more fragile because they have bones. They don't produce any body air. They don't even have any body odor. They're completely sterile of any sort of effects of testosterone on them. So they end up having very beautiful soft skin, and they often go into modeling, or they often they're running these intersex organizations because they can push people around with this rare condition. But they're completely sterile. They can't have children. Now, the lower one is partial androgen sensitivity syndrome, and this is more of a suspect. This is where the baby can be born, and it can look somewhat ambiguous. It can the baby can grow breasts and yet be kind of lower voice. When they go through puberty, they have a lower voice. They look a bit in between. They're definitely on the male side. They're males. They're just they just have aspects of a development of a female as well, but they're definitely in the male category. So, and then the one they keep pushing is this some called 5 octane
5 alpha reductase 2 deficiency.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's a extremely rare condition that is a recessive gene that both your mother and your father have to have one of these children, and that's a selective. So they are immune to a particular DHT of the testosterone, which causes male genitalia to develop. So they don't develop male genitalia, and they're often born looking very, very close to females, and they're often raised early on as females. And then when they go through puberty, about 90% of them develop penises, and they develop generally they go through puberty, and they become essentially male, and then they're called males at 12. And there's an even smaller set of those who don't develop male genitalia at all. And these are very, very rare. So they only pop up in Dominican Republic and a few other places because, again, both parents have got to have the gene. So they only come up in about 3 different countries, and there's only about 300 cases in the United States I've known it. So it is the rarest of all rare conditions.
Interesting. Yeah. So, like the allegations, are that they failed a genetic test and that they are XY, these athletes. But I've seen a number of trans activists. The first move is just to deny that and say that's just the Russian corruption of the boxing organization. But the second move is to say, well, even if they fail this genetic test by having XY, there's you can be female and have XY, and then they list these incredibly rare things. So I'm curious,
Swire syndrome, yes.
Yeah. So do you know the statistics on these rare conditions where you can be female and have an XY on the
there's only one known. There's a few known that do that, and those are called Swire syndrome. And Swire syndrome is about 1 in 80,000, so it's a very rare condition. So what happens there is the XY, so what I included in the notes. So the X chromosome has 13. It's about 1,300 genes on it. The Y chromosome has 200 genes on it. So the X chromosome does all the heavy lifting. All the heavy lifting is caused by the X chromosome. The Y chromosome just shows up and it tells the X chromosome it's going to be a male. So there are even females born with only one X chromosome. So you can get a live birth with one X chromosome. Now, sometimes in rare the Y chromosome shows up and is broken. It just doesn't work. It's like an absentee father. It just doesn't show up at all. And so they have a Y chromosome sitting there that's not doing its job. So what happens is a fetus kind of freaks out because it's like, well, what do I do now? So the X chromosome takes over. Okay, we're going to develop a fetus. We're going to develop a female. But these are basically women with no androgen exposure other than they don't have testicles. So they don't have internal testicles. So they don't have any androgen exposure. So they don't have any advantages in sports anyway. And they can get pregnant if you implant an egg into their womb, just like Turner syndrome. You can also use an egg donor, and they can get pregnant and they can give birth to live children because their bodies assumed they were female because there was no Y chromosome to tell it otherwise, because the Y chromosome is broken. So that's absolutely out of the picture. They don't look like that. They look like if you ran into someone with this condition, they would look female, and they'd be weak, and they would have the same problems that females have. They wouldn't do menstruation, but they have uteruses. They do have. I have to check if they do menstruate. They don't produce eggs though. It's called degenesis. They definitely have a difficult time during puberty, but this is not anything to do with them. The only one that has to do with is the partial androgen and the 5O reductose, and those are males.
Right. So it is interesting because I wanted to look up an interview of one of these boxers, Aman Khalif, to see what they sound like. And to my mind, the voice did not seem to have the deepness of like being dropped through testosterone. So I'm kind of curious, like in these cases, like the 5-alpha reductase 2 or whatever, do you go through puberty in the same way? Because I know there's like, something with like the DHT versus the like testosterone, and like you sort of respond to testosterone during puberty, but like during, in the womb, like you're not responsive to like DHT. So that prevents. So I'm curious, like, do these males have a kind of partial masculinization, or do they go through full? Because I just thought it was curious, or is it just one of those cases of like a male who has like a naturally high
some
voice,
males do
like,
have naturally high voices.
yeah,
It's not. I don't think that's a telltale sign. The key here is if they have a case like this, they're not sure, and they're not trusting the other people, then they just simply do a genetic test. And they said, okay, you have XY chromosomes and high testosterone. What's up? You're a guy. Well, you're supposed to be in the male category.
Right. Yeah. And I've seen a lot of people argue that, well, imagine if you were a female boxer who was accused these kind of false allegations from this corrupt Russian organization, and you're accused of being male, and that they accused you of having failed a genetic test. Like, wouldn't you sort of like have no qualms about
retaking the genetic
test? Like retaking the test, like, because you don't want your gold medal to be, have a shadow of controversy over it. You want to, be known as like beating females fair and square as like another female. It seems like that, like any female, seems like that would be like the first kind of response is like, yes, I'm confident in the fact that I'm female, so I have no problem. Like, test me all you want. You're not going to take my trophy away from me or whatever.
Yeah. This is a misconception of people who have these conditions. We have evidence. Here's the evidence of my condition. Here's I was born on puberty blockers. Here's the evidence. Or I have psoriasis syndrome, or I'm like this, or I have diabetes. They're primary health conditions that cause this. And the people who have these conditions want you to understand these things and are very much upfront about what they're suffering from. I've known people who have Turner syndrome or Klinefelter syndrome who don't just go through and say, hey, I look a little strange because I have Klinefelters, and the Klinefelters is causing my breasts to grow unusually large, and I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm just struggling with this condition, or I have difficulty with balance, or like, for instance, the most common conditions are Klinefelters and Turners, and these come with multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, neurological problems, learning disabilities. A lot of people with Klinefelters have difficulty with their kidneys, just all sorts of other health problems that you never hear about. And it's like, well, if you understood all those health problems, what all these people with these so-called intersex conditions have, It's like going, what are we talking about? We're not talking about anything. We're talking about disorders of development that just happen to affect the sex on the sex. They're just like disorders like any other disorder.
Right. So what do you think about the sort of like framing from a lot of activists, the like trans activists? They'll say things like, well, this isn't a disorder of development. This is like natural variation or something like this. So in the case of um and like going back to the debate about the puberty blockers and whether it's like, critical or necessary for like health and well-being to go through your natal puberty,
Mhm.
they sort of say that like, well, you're imposing a sort of like normative teleological framework onto nature. In reality, nature, is sort of agnostic in regards to how things ought to be. So who's to say that, we ought to go through our natal puberty, because that's imposing like a value that going through, or that, they sort of will say you're making the naturalistic fallacy by saying just because puberty is part of this like natural process, you can't say it's like good. And so I think, and sort of this concept of disorders or sexual development, I think a lot of people don't like that framing of like disorder because it like imposes some element of like normativity on the process of development, saying like it is good, and like we ought to go through our natal puberties, for health, because like health is ultimately like a normative concept. But I find this like rubs a lot of trans activists the wrong way, and they sort of want to have this like a very, they just kind of don't like that framing. So I'm curious your like thoughts on that.
Yeah. First thing, these people don't have any of these conditions, so they're wish casting on other people, and they may be very insecure themselves, and they seem to assume that the life is you're supposed to be comfortable all the time, like life. You're born with these development milestones, and these development milestones are yours as a human being. This is what you do. This is how humans develop. I mean, they used to give growth hormones to people, and then they stopped doing that. Then they gave um, when they were in too much pain, they gave Oxycontin, and looked how that came out. So anytime we try to interfere with the natural development is what they're trying to do. We're not talking about some reproductive thing. We're talking about the natural development within the human genome. Anytime they've tried to mess with that, or even mess with people's IQ, or kind of had designer babies or something like that, they end up with worse outcomes than they started with. So if you left the child alone to develop and just and handled their psychological issues as psychological issues, and not been stewing in this culture of everybody has got to be validated for everything, and people need to be comfortable. Our ancestors didn't live in that world. Our
Right.
ancestors lived in a world of where they suffered, and their fellow humans suffered with them. We suffered as a
Right.
community.
Yeah, it is very ironic to me how these trans activists think about evolution, for example, in the context of understanding natural development and like, childhood development, and just the concept of development as like a natural process. Because it used to be, I remember back in like the 2000s, the like there's, the like left, or the Democrats or the liberals, they were the party of evolution and pro science, fighting against the moral right and the religious intelligent design people. There's all these debates, and so it was like this believe in science, but there seems to be this like reluctance to appreciate mother nature from from an evolutionary perspective, and they don't seem to buy into the argument that you just laid out, which I took to be, mother nature is smarter than us. And if mother nature, through the natural selective evolutionary process, has like puberty as a process has survived all these, hundreds of thousands or millions of years because it works. It's proven. It's, what has been around for a long time and stood the test of time. So there's like kind of a natural evolutionary logic to trusting Mother Nature, not trying to interfere with it unless we really know what we're doing, which we often don't.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
hubris of humanity. So why do you think so many people these days aren't appreciative of that kind of logic of, evolution, um, sort of providing a way to understand what is good for us in terms of development?
Well, it seems like they have two positions. They kind of had this cognitive. They have two positions simultaneously. They're worried about global warming and they're worrying about all this other stuff that man's doing to nature. But they seem to want man to, humanity to start messing with our actual structure of our development and without any sort of limitation. So they seem to have there's like, no, you can't, we got to do all this. We got to protect nature. But then but to ourselves, we do anything we want. We can, inject ourselves with growth hormone. We can stop our child's puberty, our child's discomfort. We have to get the medication. We have to put them on, lifelong medical paths and all this other stuff because these hormones. We have to be slaves to these pharmaceuticals because we just don't want to deal with our own natural development. Yet at the same time, we lecture everybody else for, developing, even, why are we going to Mars? Well, we're going from Mars because, it's interesting.
Right.
It's like they very anti-progressive as far as human ingenuity in this part, yet they want to mess with everything and human development. It's bizarre.
So there's a lot of people who get into, within the gender critical world, there's a certain conspiratorialism in regards to big pharma, which I personally am like fully on board with like, being skeptical of big pharma, and the sort of role, and you can sort of get into a sort of a, you know, um, this idea that a lot of this gender medicine, it is sort of like interesting that the party, the Democratic Party and the liberals who used to be against the corruption of, big pharma,
Mhm. Yeah,
pushing
they've invited them in.
for the like, and pushing for organic food and all natural, the sort of like your kind of Californian, liberal stereotype of like natural's
Yeah.
better, organic's better, don't trust, or like they're like constantly criticizing the privatization of like the healthcare and like the influence of profiteering and the medical industry, and the critique of capitalism is like very common within these communities of activists. But strangely, it's become a political right to have access to a pharmaceutical puberty blocker drug that will put you down a medical pathway that is going to be a big money
Lifelong
for the
money
insurance,
marketing.
for the insurance companies and the doctors for the rest of your life, which is like great for if you're in the healthcare business, that's good business.
Yeah. Yes. I have no idea why they. So for some reason it just started in San Francisco, this queer theory, and it was like a virus. It just invaded the consciousness of everybody. And I think what happened is it got into LGBT rights, and they were corrupt, and they got used to all the money coming in, and they needed another cause, and they saw this, and they just adopted that cause regardless about what the consequences were. And now they just can't stop. Now they've marbled themselves into this political establishment, and they have gone down this road where they've convinced everybody that there's all these genders, and we have to, we have to go in there and actually alter people's development to match their perceived gender at 12 or something. And it's just, I don't think they can stop, because if they stop, the the receipts that they've built up over the time with all these broken bodies and infertility. And I read about one kid who took puberty blockers, and which is an occurrence, they can develop osteoporosis because their bodies don't the calcium doesn't absorb into their bones, and this is a real problem in hypogonadism because osteoporosis can happen very quickly, and it's irreversible. So that kid is, I think he's Dutch, is now disabled for the rest of his life. He will suffer from bone fractures, spinal cord injuries, and stuff like that for the rest of his life. He's permanently like that. Yet that's an okay cost to pay.
I often hear this sort of like painting over these risks by just calling them bone density problems. Like it's sort of like it sort of sounds like, oh yeah, like it's sort of such an abstract thing that it doesn't translate. Oh yeah, like my bone density is like a little bit impacted. No big deal. Like it's sort of we use these sort of euphemistic phrases when we're kind of spelling out the risk profile. I mean, it just becomes easy to like paint over that. It's like, oh yeah, bone density, no big deal. Like it's like
it's all theoretical until you crack until your disc slips out and you're in bed in absolute pain. You're going, well, this is more pain than the gender dysphoria. So my gender dysphoria has gone away, but now I have now I can't get out of bed anymore. I'm so much in pain.
Yeah, and often the gender dysphoria doesn't go away, or it can often get worse. Like
it can get worse too. Because they assume they had some sort of issue, and then they realize, oh no, I was really just insecure, and I should have had some sort of other counseling. So gender dysphoria is very it is dependent on the society we live in, and it may be something going on within our society about how we dress women up and put makeup on them, and men don't. Because traditionally men and women wore makeup. There was a man's makeup, and makeup was more of a tribal thing than it was a signification of sex. But as soon as we started getting all this, we started taking the productization of womanhood, and we started turning this into a product that somebody wants to own or possess. It seems like a bunch of men suddenly wanted to possess that thing. It's quite interesting. Yes.
Well, returning to the topic of autogonophilia, there's this sort of there's like different flavors of autogonophilia. For some, it's it's like anatomic AGP, such that you have severe phobia and you're like repulsed by like your genitals. But then there's other forms that are called like partial AGP, where you don't fully dislike your male anatomy, like your genitals. So you're okay with having a penis, but often by watching female pornography, you develop an envy of that female body. And so you become it's called partial AGP. And so I think the rise of the internet and I honestly think that the rise of transgender pornography, which is one of the most commonly watched genres of porn by straight men. And so these straight men who have this underlying autogonophilic predisposition, who have a partial form that's not severe in dysphoria, where 30, 40 years ago, that dysphoria would never have been triggered to a severe degree to motivate them to seek out these transsexual services, when there was like true gatekeeping in place, and you kind of had to be full-blown dysphoric and want to go all the way. Whereas nowadays, like there's this rise of these like so I do think people talk about social contagion within the adolescent female space, but I also think for these younger males as well, like the like confluence of the internet and pornography and the partial AGP is sort of like making there's a whole new breed, and often these younger AGPs are transitioning at a younger and younger age, because So there's just more like awareness of like
Yeah.
this as a possibility model, which is causing, whereas before it was like, you would just suppress this for decades until you have a midlife crisis, and then like so suddenly you
Buy
want
a
to.
car, or you run
Yeah,
away from another woman, or you
yeah.
cross us. But yeah, I have a theory about this. I mean, so when I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was in 13, which is common among people who have development disorders. But they put me on medication, and I reacted very badly. So I never got the ADHD treated, and I dealt with it for my rest of my life. And what happened was it got to the point where I was craving sweets. Like I couldn't get through the day without going and buying sweets. And I was just the craving was just becoming overwhelming, and I was gaining way too much weight. And I'm like going, finally I said, I can't stop thinking about sweets, or I can't start thinking about cupcakes or candy. And I called up I signed up to a psychological thing, and they went through all these things, and they diagnosed me with ADHD, which I had documentation before. And they said, well, this may be the root of your problem. This utter craving. I mean, it consumed me. I could not do anything other than think about food and stuff like that, particularly as I got older, because actually your ADHD, if it lasts, you lose the abilities to suppress it. So as you age, your mind becomes weaker. It kind of doesn't, like, for instance, with these men with AGP, it just can't, the mind can't manage it anymore. So what they did is they gave me a brand new medication, which is something that I didn't really want to take, but I took it anyway, which was a norepinephrine inhibitor. What it does is just it cranked up the norepinephrine in my frontal lobe, which is a central processing unit that filters out all those things that come through. And within 2 months, I lost 30 pounds, and I just stopped. I mean, I go by the cookie jar, and it's like I have one cookie, and it used to be like Vicodin. You just get, I mean, it was like, oh my God. Now I eat it, and it's like Tylenol. It's like, oh, it's good, but I could just put it away. I mean, it completely transformed my desire over those objects. Just 180, to the point where it's like, I don't even remember what it was like to be like that anymore. And I'm like going, wow, I think it's because we live in such a world that is filled with this desirable objects on every front, that our minds that were used, which evolved in like nomadic tribes with very little stimulation,
Right,
just a lot of us just can't handle it because
right,
we're not developed that way.
right. There's so much novelty in the modern digital environment, that it's like, in our evolutionary environment, you would have been experiencing these same stimuli more or less, because you're
Mhm.
kind of in the same location, you're looking at the same people, having the same sort of like, cyclical phenomena that are in these like cyclical patterns, like the natural rhythms of like your environment. Whereas now you can go on your Twitter feed or TikTok and scroll and expose yourself to novel stimuli that are so we experience so much more novelty. And this is there's some theories that like this rise of novelty in an environment has like changed the way we dream. So for example,
Mhm.
in like these traditional hunter-gatherer societies, often their dream worlds are like replicas of it's like just like an alternative version of their current or of like the real world, because they don't experience enough novelty. Whereas like the modern dreamer in these Western civilizations, like the dreams they're random, because they're sort of driven by there's like so much like novel stimuli that it kind of scrambles like the simulator in our minds. And
Yeah.
I think, and particularly going back to the pornography thing, which I think people don't
That's
talk about as
something
much. But I do think it,
highly stimulating. And I could see that
yeah,
the people who have little age, they're going through puberty and stuff like that. It's so stimulating. It's like it's visual crack.
right.
And they
It's
just
also
yes.
it's like a hyper stimulus, which is like a super normal stimulus that would not exist in nature. Like
Yes.
the shemale visual image of like the breast and the dick in the evolution environment, you would have almost never encountered that specific visual stimulus. Whereas, and then so much of the pornography that people are exposed to, particularly in a young age, are just like this hentai cartoons that sort of
Mhm.
take that combination, which is already rare, and then exaggerate the parameters of these morphologies of bodies, and it just creates this like hyper stimulus that just like kind of overloads the
It
brain. And I think
overloads.
and a lot of, I think, fetishistic development or perfect development is due to kind of like exposure to these like hyper stimuli that kind of like overwhelm the brain at a young age, and it kind of
Mhm.
imprints the hyper stimulus onto that young developing brain, and you kind of just permanently like you stumbled across some particular niche of pornography when you were 12 years old on the internet, and then now that's like your kink for like the rest of your life. And I think
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely think this is having like an impact on young males.
Yeah. Also, like I believe they did some research with sex and stuff like that with males. It takes over the whole brain. So, like, if you had depression, or if you're sad, or if you're lonely, or if you're grieving, uh, sex will just simply take all those emotions and just throw them out. And it and
I wanted to come back to the intersex controversy in the Olympics because I saw a lot of trans activists use this opportunity to sort of like do the common ideological move, which is to say that the existence of intersex conditions or disorders of sexual development, whatever you want to call them, they are an argument for this sort of layer cake model of sex where there's sort of like all these different types of sex. There's like your chromosomal sex, your gonadal sex, your morphological sex, your endocrinological sex. You kind of have this layer cake model, and they sort of say like, well, see, intersex shows that sex is a spectrum, and you know there's not this like binary between male and female, and that's like an artificial construction. In reality, it's like this complex spectrum and layer of these different things. And so when we say that this boxer or these athletes are male, I think so much of the problem with gender ideology is like we don't even have consensus in our society anymore about what is it that we mean when we say that someone is male. Like, what does that mean? So I'm curious,
yeah.
like your perspective, like when you say that you go through male puberty, like, or you go through this or that, or what does it mean to be male? I feel like we don't have a consensus anymore.
Well, yeah, a male is a biological sex. Um, it's a biological sex category of Homo sapiens or mammals. So everybody is put either in a female or male category, and the intersex. And I only spoke about that rare one that's very unusual. Those are disorders within sex development. So they belong to a category. They just don't, some of them have certain traits that may be perceived as the opposite sex, but they're not, because they're in a category that biological sex, that the biological dictates them to be in. So biological sex is not a choice. It's something you're born with. It's something you inherit from your genetics, from your ancestors, and it's there for reproduction. And it also, in Homo sapiens, it comes with the fact that women need to give birth. So women's bodies are compromised just enough so they're not as strong, and so they can actually reproduce humans. So that requires a lot of heavy lifting on nature's part to be able to have a human give birth, because we have to gestate a baby within 9 months. The baby has got this brain that's oversized for humans, and they got to give birth, and the mother has got to survive that birth. So these are very, very, very biologically determined processes, and they are, so much can go wrong, and women can die in childbirth and so on. So they're dependent on their partners, which were traditionally males, to basically do all the hunting, do all the fishing, do all the gathering, do all these other things. So males have a role, but females have the most important role of all. And this is something that is just as biological, humans, mammals in nature. This is something we just have to get used to. Now, as far as the trans activists, they're confusing stereotypical behaviors, roles, and even varying things like breasts and stuff like that. They're confusing those things, the paraphernalia of sex, with sex itself. So they're saying, well, there's this big spectrum. Well, some women have small breasts, some women have big breasts. Well, that doesn't matter. They're women. The secondary sex characteristics, the way they present, varies, and their behavior varies. But we both occupy a separate biological category. And like, for instance, I said that most 90% of the DSDs or disorders or difference in sex development, we used to went with differences when it was very negative, but now we're back to disorders because we keep being told that we have no problem. I said, we have all these health problems and you're ignoring everything. A lot of disabled people have also came out and say, wait a minute, I have to go to dialysis every week. I'm not living the golden life here. Okay. And you guys are taking my condition. So there's a lot of stolen valor going on, or pretendians that are coming into the intersex who are just claiming, hey, I take cross-sex hormones, I'm intersex because now I'm showing different aspects, secondary sex characteristics.
Right. So speaking of that, like, it is, like you just mentioned, like, it is very common, these pretendians, these trans people, they sort of want to be intersex. They, I've seen many, stories of trans women sort of like wanting to get a genetic chromosomal test in order to sort of validate that they are, I think there's this perception that if you are intersex, then, or you have a DSD, then, you are more valid in your gender dysphoria. And also there's this big argument to say that transness is a sort of neurological intersex, such that these sexually dimorphic areas of the brain are shifted in trans people, and that shift to the opposite sex in these sexually dimorphic regions is like an explanation of like why you're born with this like desire, or you like feel like you have the wrong body because like your these like areas are like shifted, and that explains like the mismatch of like your like the body you were born with and the desire that you feel you ought to have had, which causes this like this incongruence. And I've seen like people like Dr. Robert Sapolsky sort of talk about this like idea of like neurological intersex is like an explanation, or these sort of like mosaic of like shifting brain regions in cross-sex shifting of these dimorphic regions to sort of like say that this proves that like gender identity is like real and it's valid, and like, you know, and I see it very, very common. So I think I would love to hear your perspective on this idea of like transness as neurologically intersex, and like why the trans activists, or like why not even the activists, but just like your regular trans people are so like desirous of that theory being true, because it's like validating psychologically.
Yeah. I think it's because they're very insecure, and they have a kind of a cognitive disconnect between what they want in their minds and what is possible in reality. So they keep trying to justify these two things. The fact is that we have, trans men getting pregnant. That's because they're female. If trans women can have sire children, they're male. So these are biological categories that are fixed, and it's obvious by their behavior and what they've done with their bodies that that's where they're at. Because it doesn't matter what they think they have. It matters of what their biology dictates they're supposed to have. So they can try to trick themselves as much as possible, but it's just going to make their gender dysphoria probably worse, and it's probably going to make them more and more insecure, because they'll never ever arrive at that location. They'll never ever feel comfortable, because there'll always be something else that they need to adjust. There'll always be now I've transitioned, and now I'm not, I transitioned as a child, and now I'm having all these health problems, and now I have bone density issues, and now I women still don't accept me, and there'll always be another layer of something they need fixed. And this is the ratcheting problem within gender ideology, and you've seen it, began, and then suddenly it's like there was never enough until we now we do puberty blockers, and they're not working, and now we have to do this, and now we have to do that. So I think that these individuals need to stop looking for external validation and start working on their own inner psychological conditions to adjust to what they're going through, because they're never going to be able to get everybody to obey their pronouns. They're never going to be able to get everybody to go along with their, non-binary status. It is exhausting to do that. And it's promising people, and people younger watch them, of a world that's never going to really accept them for who they are, because the world doesn't really accept anybody for who they are.
Well, the framing is that, well, this is not our fault. This is the fault of society for being too transphobic. Society is cis normative, and it sort of privileges cis identities, cis, it's sort of like the ideological framework of, we can, but, they'll say that that's like cis normative, because you're sort of saying that the trans identity is necessarily, less valid, less real, less, healthy, less normative. So it's really like we ought to focus on making society more accepting of trans people. And then, because the problems you just listed in terms of like the development of this identity, they're problems of society not accepting you. Well, that's not the fault of the condition. That's the fault of,
of their psychological conditioning.
Yeah.
I mean, you can only do so much. I mean, you can't say, well, women, they're going to have to just put up with all these 6'2" trans people in their sports, and they're going to have to lose all their trophies, and because these people need to be accepted. Well, as you see, other people are starting not to be accepted now. Women are being, told to be apologize, or they can't compete, or they can't run as fast. And so that it's caused far more grief, and it's probably caused far more trouble. I think other people like Buck would agree, for them to insist, to force, to become so authoritatively that society has got to bend to our particular wishes and ignore all these other needs that other people have. And that's really where it's at, that currently, that they just have this thing where we're suffering, and we have to have all these accepting and all these rules broken to accept us, and we don't really care about the consequences to either our development or our children's development, or other women who may be denied trophies, or may be denied scholarships, because it's our feelings that are more important than theirs, and that's just not the way reality works.
Right. Well, there's this underlying theoretical superstructure that provides like an ideological framework for that sort of like trade-off of oppression Olympics, because they'll say that like, well, yeah, there's this like possibly this conflict of rights and priorities of women versus trans women, but trans women are marginalized, and so sort of this assumption within leftist politics that the trans identity is the most marginalized of all identities, the lowest on the oppression totem pole. And therefore, when we're doing our intersectional feminism, whatever, you sort of do your matrix of oppression. When you get the trans identity, it gives you like a 100 times multiplier bonus on your oppression scorecard, such that your concerns as this vulnerable community outweigh the natal females, because they have what would be called cisgender privilege, so they're privileged by the fact that they were born female and that they identify as female. So it's sort of like they baked into the framing that these like trade-offs are okay. And so it's kind of feels fuels the narcissistic like centering of the trans experience as being the most important thing to focus on.
I mean, if you look at outcomes of minority groups, the one on the bottom are usually the disabled, the people who have been born with Down syndrome, who have Lou Gehrig's disease, who are paralyzed, who do all these things. These things have far more life complications and limitations than most other people even endure. But there are not very many people, so they don't have a real political machine that somehow profits off their distress, because for some reason the political establishment has picked these special people to represent all of our own societal problems. And if we just fix it for these people, somehow society will be right again. And I don't think that's not how we should conduct a society. You really have to average people's rights together and figure out what is actually going on and who's actually being discriminated against. And trans people have actually had they have had, I believe they've been judges actually have higher IQs. They tend to be in the military. They tend to be high risk takers. They tend to be pretty successful people. They don't, particularly AGPs, they have some, I know several AGPs, and they were the smartest people I know. I mean, they were incredibly intelligent and had incredibly good positions. They struggled with their internal desires, but they're doing really good. I mean, they were doing very good. They're doing better than I do. They were, a senior engineer at Apple, and they're in government. They always have all these wonderful jobs. I'm like, God,
Yeah.
So I don't understand why they feel they're so suppressed, other than the fact that their internal compassing is all wrong. I don't understand that.
Right. Well, I think there's, if we're sticking with the Blanchardine typology, we have to keep in mind the homosexual transsexuals, which, historically were, I think, more represented, decades ago in the gender clinics in terms of like the classic stereotype that you would see, and also, and within that cohort, they often resorted to, for example, sex work, and they sort of lived these more difficult lives because they're kind of like on the street, working as call girls, trying to survive. And so I think there that sort of developed this narrative of like that, and they're often dealing with the same issues that gay men experience with like with like AIDS and HIV and stuff.
Mm.
And so I think that's where a lot of the nonprofit funding for the trans community started off in like the 90s in regards to
Yeah.
that like connection, because these trans women who were of the more homosexual type, having resorted to um you know sex work and stuff to survive, to pay for their surgeries and stuff, when all this wasn't covered by your Starbucks insurance, and
Yeah.
you had to
A lot
pay,
of
you
stuff
had to
covered by yourself. There's,
pay out
um,
of pocket. So, and then like these sort of organophilic type, they sort of like took that inherent momentum of that nonprofit industry that arose out of providing resources for that more vulnerable population. They sort of like latched onto this narrative that trans women, they're at risk of being murdered and assaulted, and they're like you like your average trans woman lives to be 30. I remember when I transitioned like 9 years ago, I started Googling, like, what is it like to be a trans woman? And I found all these statistics about like, oh, your average trans woman lives to be like 32 or something. And I was like so scared by these statistics because they were referring to this other cohort that, engages in this
it's a
dangerous sex
very
work.
risky behavior. Now that was part of homophobia. And when homophobia got better, those trans people became more and more accepted. And so it wasn't like as gay rights progressed, trans were left behind. They were coming along right with them, because the homophobics didn't, okay, well, you have an extra layer of makeup, you're okay. They didn't distinguish between gays or transsexuals. They were all just basically in the same boat. And as far as prostitution, those are societal problems that need to be addressed at a much more fundamental level, because there's a lot of, sex trafficking is something that's primary victim of women, particularly women in other countries who don't have many rights. So those are problems that can be addressed. And certainly, if somebody is old enough and understands enough, I would not deny them things like transition or anything like that. But I would, certainly these surgeries have had devastating effects on people. And I think within the trans community, there's a kind of a culture of secrecy to say, if you transition or if you got a surgery, if you got this, you're supposed to go back and tell your community saying, I'm all great. When really, I've heard a lot of people on programs say that, no, we got that so-called surgery and it was horrible, but we couldn't say anything because it would be humiliating. We went through all this and it didn't work out. So,
Right.
what am I going to say? Oh, I made a mistake. No, then you would be seen as adding into the transphobia. So they just stayed silent. So this created a
Right.
spiral of silence within these communities.
Yeah. And I think, that sort of problem of sort of there's a huge methodological wrench in all the data about post-surgical regret, because you don't see this in other sorts of medical procedures like knee surgery. There's not like a community of knee surgery patients that are all sort of sharing tips with each other, and
Yeah,
doing
no,
they're not doing like political advocacy for like that the rights to have access to like knee surgery and like all this stuff. And so, you have a more objective, survey when you're doing like these like surgical follow-ups in regards to regret rates or satisfaction rates or whatever. And you can actually have like objective, data. Whereas in the trans case, because it's connected to these political movements, these like, like when you get a survey about like whether you regret your surgery, you can have a totally botched surgery and say that you don't regret it because you don't want to make you like don't want to say anything bad about like the procedure because you don't want to cause other people to not have access or to you're like worried about imposing more gatekeeping or something, or having skepticism about these procedures. And so I think it just like makes it difficult to gather accurate data, and not to mention the like kind of personal psychological sunk cost fallacies that you were talking about in regards to like, well, there's no going back, you gotta make peace with it. And so like
the regret rate, well, the regret, surgical regret is being horribly weaponized and misused. Surgical regret, the biggest the surgery that has the most surgical regret is actually prostate surgery. It's actually something they keep, because since my prostate enlarged because I take androgen and my androgen levels are higher than causes my prostate to enlarge. And there's a surgery to fix that. It's called, but it has an 80% regret rate. And it's because when you do surgery on the prostate, you destroy sexual function. You could possibly cause incontinence and all this other stuff. But in some, that doesn't mean that the surgery itself is not medically necessary. That means that the surgery itself, they need to fix the surgery or figure out some other way of doing this to get the same results, but not causing all those side effects. So like, hip surgery, well, if there's a high regret rate, the hip surgery itself is required. It's a medically necessary procedure. But the surgery itself needs to be altered or changed so people don't regret the side effects later. And this is where it's confused. This is where the confusion lies. If the surgery is not required or is optional or is cosmetic or causes sexual dysfunction and is not necessary for basic functions, and you put a child through those surgeries and you permanently disable their sexual function, that's a whole different area. That's like malpractice area. That's not surgical regret. That's not a genuine surgery which fixes a problem the child had. That's an optional surgery that you've convinced the child needs. I mean, like for instance, Richie would be on program saying my psychologist was saying, oh, this surgery will fix you. There is no such thing as a doctor who would ever say that. Even if the surgery is like cancer or fix cancer, they'll never, ever pressure you into surgery. And if that's going on, like Richie said, there's something really wrong with that, because no one should be pressuring you in any sort of surgery or anything. And so when I hear those surgeries, I'm like, those things like pressuring, what are these people doing? Is this a cult? Is this like are they, there's something really wrong there.
Yeah, totally. So we're coming up on an hour and a half, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about, other areas where youth that we haven't already covered, possibly where the sort of intersection of gender ideology and intersex, they're sort of misusing it or abusing it. We've talked about like the sports stuff, the pretendians, the kind of like the debate about the sex binary. So where do you think there's other stuff that's not commonly talked about in regards to like how the trans community is sort of like misappropriating intersex conditions to push some ideological agenda?
Well, the main thing that bothers people, particularly with people with these conditions, is everybody's talking about really rare conditions that hardly anybody has, or only conditions that people in certain countries have. And they're very odd and they're unusual, and they often show up in high-end sports because they're sought after because they have these characteristics. And they talk about it like these people are like you trip over them during, you run into them at the 7-Eleven. These people are like, some of them are rare as running into someone with two heads. And the majority of us are sitting here with the like 70% of the DSDs are just mere health conditions, chronic health conditions that I sent you the notes. You can link them, which cause osteoporosis, which cause rheumatoid arthritis, which cause all sorts of chronic health issues. And then there's a percentage of them that just cause infertility, so they have to get some infertility treatment. That's 99% of the rare conditions. They're just standard. Oh, I have, it's like diabetes. Like my condition is like diabetes with hormones. That's all. It's nothing. There's nothing else going on with me, and there's nothing else going on with all these other people. And none of these other people are taking advantage of sports or going into women's sports or going into locker rooms, or none of that's happening, except in this very, very small percentage of community that seems to think these intersex conditions are just 2% of the population when they're not. Or you have a bunch of trans activists claiming to have intersex conditions, and they go and say, well, I was born with both males and female genitalia, and then the doctors decided. That never happens. None of that ever happens. So a lot of fantasizing about, like, people just fantasizing online, and people like take them seriously. So that's one aspect of it. And it's been really weaponized and confused. And the people who have these conditions, there's not very many authentic ones. And they're just run over by larger trans activists, cult-like organizations, or the intersex rights who talk about unnecessary surgeries. Unnecessary surgeries do happen. Most people, like me, myself, all my surgeries were required, so I was never victimized. They did the best they could. But there's just so much misinformation about how our lives live, how our lives are actually lived, and what we struggle with. And we're immediately thrown into these activists who fantasize online about things. And unfortunately, there's really no way at this point of trying to separate this stuff out, because people are just far too confused. Now people just deny they have these conditions because they don't want to be confused with all the crazies. And I've even heard other trans or homosexual transsexuals say, I don't want anything to do with trans anymore because I don't want to be thrown in with the crazies. And it's really sad that we've come to this point where people, where the results of this juggernaut of ideology is actually hurting people they're supposed to be helping. So that's basically what I wanted to say. And
yeah,
well,
I super appreciate you coming on my channel and talking about this. I think this is like a really important topic, and you have a very unique perspective and a lot of like a wealth of information, and this has been a really great conversation. I'm hoping my audience found it useful.
yeah.
So where can people find you, and like what are you working on? Are you still making YouTube content?
Yes. So I can send you my my Twitter profile and my Intersex Truther video. I'm right now working on a video compilation because I've been a Buddhist for 15 years, and I really want to, because a lot of people are confused with therapy and like trauma-based therapy and stuff like that. So I'm gonna actually take apart gender ideology and talk a bit about what thousands of years of studying why people suffer and what they identify with, and how people become confused with, like, they reify identities, and this is actually a big part of suffering, and another way in which you can handle your own inner turmoil and inner emotional conflict, rather than resulting to all this external drugs and altering and trying to make everybody use your pronouns properly, because this is causing a lot more suffering. So that's what I'm working on right now.
I love that. Like I've also studied Buddhism a lot over the course of my life, and yeah, I think that I'm not sure if you ever listened to Alan Watts, but he was always one of my
Oh
favorite
yes, Alan Watts is
Zen guys, and he had this famous lecture where he talked about this sort of like progression in life where you sort of, you know, put off your happiness, you put off living in the present moment and to the next milestone in life. It's like, oh, I'll be happy when I finish high school, and then I'll be happy when I finish college, then I'll be happy when I get a good job, and then I'll be happy when I get a family, and then I'll be happy. And I sort of see that sort of same thing in the trans community, where you sort of like put off your happiness until your next big like transition like milestone. And I think that this perspective from Buddhism about like radical acceptance of like like radically accepting the reality of the present moment, and not, and having like a non-judgmental attitude in regards to reality, I think would be very powerful therapeutically. And like I think, yeah, like I think that's really important. So I'm like definitely looking forward to you putting out that content, because I think
and I come on and talk about that concept, because I really want to get that concept content done. It's so vast. It's like, okay, I want to do it this way, and it's like going, well, I will lose them. It's something that I think that people will find very helpful and find very informative.
Definitely. Well, this has been a very fantastic conversation. Thanks for coming on. And
thank you.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna end the recording.
Okay.
Okay, take care.